Hey friends, welcome back to another Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne. Hey Layne.
Welcome everyone.
So friends, if you are listening to us on your favorite podcast app, we just want to invite you to jump on over to YouTube because you'll get to see the beautiful amaryllis that is blooming behind Layne. What a beauty, Layne.
Thank you.
So friends, welcome. Today we have a great topic to talk about. But first, before we jump in, just want to invite you to investigate over at thegardenersworkshop.com, who sponsors this podcast, where you can learn all about our online garden shop, our online course library, and so much more. And you can learn just more about the work that we're doing. Layne Angelo, who is our seed manager. That's where she and I kind of spend our days focusing on thegardenersworkshop.com. So Layne, what are we talking about today?
So today we are talking about a subject that makes people a little bit sad, and that is thinning. And we're specifically talking about thinning beds that you may have direct seeded or that seeded themselves. So we're not talking about thinning in seed trays, but thinning your direct seeded and self-sown beds outdoors. So we're going to find out when you should do that, the best methods to do that, and just some general information.
Sounds good.
And by the way, direct seeding refers to sowing seeds directly outdoors in the garden rather than starting transplants indoors.
Yeah.
And episodes 4, 5, and 20 are related to direct seeding if you'd like any more information on that subject. So the first question is going to be, in terms of direct seeded or self-sown beds, what is thinning and why is it necessary?
Sure. So let's first talk about direct seeded. What that means is sowing seeds directly in the garden versus in place of starting indoors. And my method of direct sowing, which has led me to be a really successful direct sower, is you have to oversow, meaning you have to plant more seeds than plants you're going to ultimately need in the garden, because y'all, stuff just happens. And so you don't want to have holes in your garden. Self-sowers are those plants that distribute and scatter their own seeds. So they obviously just a lot of times will dump a bunch of seeds right close together, or just closer together than you actually need the plants to be. So thinning means that you are the one that has to go in there and remove those seedlings that are growing too close. I mean, they're like shoulder to shoulder. It looks really okay when they're tiny, but as they start to grow, you realize how they are really suffering.
And like Lisa just said, when you direct seed, you're putting down a lot more seed than the number of plants you're ultimately hoping to end up with, just to guarantee you're going to have a nice thick stand. So
Right.
We're oversowing. Things are not spaced out perfectly like they would be with your transplants. And ultimately, if you had really good germination, which is a good thing, your seedlings are going to end up being overcrowded. And when seedlings are overcrowded, there is less air circulation between the plants. Disease can spread more easily, and the plants are just competing for water, for nutrients, sunlight, and it can just result in a really stressful, unhealthy situation where the plants are actually weaker and less productive, and none of the plants can really flourish. And I've said it before, but thinning to me is like seedling social distancing.
That's cute. And, the other thing, I think what we need to always have in the back of our mind when we're doing this is that seedlings that are exactly what Layne just described, struggling, are more susceptible to disease and pest. They literally send up flags saying, "Come and get me." So that's what really drives us to be vicious thinners.
Yes. All right. So what are the consequences of not thinning? And feel free to share any examples from your personal experience if you have any.
Sure. So, oh my goodness. Let's talk about bachelor buttons, which is one that we have on occasion allowed them to just kind of stay thick. and thinking it's going to be okay. In my mind, I'm thinking, all right, those flowers are small. There isn't a lot of, broadleaf vegetation. But I will tell you that I got tiny flowers and not as many of them when they're overcrowded, in addition to the disease and pest problem. And it just makes it more difficult to harvest also in some events. But the size and the quality of the end, the whole point of why you're growing them, right? The flower is the problem. I mean, Bells of Ireland is a great example. If you don't thin Bells of Ireland, you're never going to get that. We got 36 to 40-inch stems one year, direct sowing outdoors in the field. I mean, that's just unheard of. And we'll get 24 inches, which are tall enough. But those tall stems, guess what? That was the year that I was an aggressive thinner at the proper time.
Yeah. So the plants could end up to be weaker, less productive, or like you've mentioned, the flowers might be smaller. The height might not be what you were expecting. They just might not live up to their full potential just because of this overcrowded situation.
Right. Exactly.
And like we've mentioned, the overcrowding may make them more susceptible to pest and disease issues.
Yes.
Okay, so with that being said, there are actually some plants that may be able to handle a little bit of crowding better than others. So are there any direct seeded plants that you actually don't thin? And why is that? And I'm going to pull up a slide to jog your memory with all the plants we typically recommend direct sowing.
Sure, and thank you for that. So looking at this list, so Bupleurum, which I do tend to overseed. I'm not as bad as I used to be now that I'm so successful getting a great stand of Bupleurum when we direct sow. But if it is really oversown, you have to thin it some. What I will say as a general reference, because I have been very guilty of oversowing, is if there is, I don't mind leaving a couple of Bupleurums 2 to 3 inches apart. But if you have a gang of a bunch together, you have got to make it so it's a single file row, if that makes sense. So you don't have them 2 and 3 and 4 deep from side to side as well as crowded. They have to have some space. So Bupleurum is one that I'm not really aggressive with. I'll go a little lighter hand. Dill also. I have great results with crowded dill. And poppies, and I'm talking of the Iceland poppies. I don't do them quite as aggressively because I have frankly found even when 3 or 4 are clustered together, as long as there's not a continuous line of clusters, they really go on to produce strong, tall stems and a lot of blooms. And Nigella also falls in that family where I'm just not as aggressive.
Yeah. So to summarize, depending on how thickly you've sown, you might be able to get away with not thinning or lightly thinning Bupleurum, dill, Iceland poppies, and Nigella, which is Levena mist, but you should consider thinning the remaining plants on this list, which are Atriplex, bachelor buttons, bells of Ireland, Chinese forget-me-nots, corn cockle or agrostemma, larkspur or Leia, giant poppy pods, and soapwort or saponaria.
Yes.
And that's something people can also experiment with. Maybe they can leave a little patch that they've sown too thickly, and they can just see the difference between that and a section that they've actually thinned.
And that's a great example and a suggestion to do that. That's the only way you really learn.
Yeah.
You know?
All right. So now let's talk about when people should thin these direct seeded beds. So let's say you direct seeded a bed in the fall and you see right away that a lot of those seeds are germinating and you're very tempted right then and there to go ahead and start thinning it out. So can you talk about why it might be a better idea to wait and when you actually recommend thinning those direct seeded beds that you sowed in the fall?
Sure. So the reason I don't thin in the fall or late or early winter, I guess we would say, is because, there's always the chance that something's going to happen. Whether a varmint gets in there and stirs up your seedlings and takes some of them out. So I've always, just as a safety net, kind of waited. But the optimal time for my garden is to actually thin before they really start growing in very early spring. And it's earlier than what most people think. You want to get them before they start elongating, because that's when it's really going to decide how tall it's going to get. So this is a really good, so for us, very early spring is mid-February. It's kind of cold then. But that's the time to go out there and pull your row covers down if you're using them, and take a look and start thinning. And yeah, so you want to do it before they start growing. So that's what you need to apply in your garden.
Yeah. So for beds that you sowed in the fall, it can be a good idea to wait until very early spring to thin them out, just so you can see what actually made it through winter.
Yeah.
And if you can catch the plants before they start to put on a lot of growth, that is ideal.
Yes.
And how about if someone direct seeds something, a warm season tender annual, maybe in the late spring or summer? When should they go ahead and thin their seedlings?
Sure. So that's a great question. And we don't do that much of that, hardly ever. But again, once they germinate and get a couple of sets of leaves on them, it's time to start thinning those babies out so they can really start. You want to prevent them from stretching for light instead of sitting there and growing their broad leaves and things from side to side. So soon after they germinate would be my guess or my plan for that.
So for fall direct seeded beds, it's better to wait, just because they're having to go through winter and you never know what's going to happen. But if you're sowing at a different time, like late spring or summer, you can go ahead and thin those seedlings out once they have a couple of sets of true leaves on them.
Yeah.
So is it ever too late to thin? So let's say someone had left a bed and they thought it looked so good when the seedlings were very small, and they decided, oh, I'm not going to thin this. And then as they start growing larger, they realize we might have a problem here. So is it ever too late to thin? Because as the plants grow, their roots are actually intermingling and getting intertwined with their neighbors, and you risk more disturbance to the remaining plants.
Yeah.
So is it worse to potentially disturb the plants you're leaving in, or is it worse not to thin at all? Is it ever too late?
I would say no. I mean, it's kind of like bailing the boat, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you might as well do what you can, particularly, let's just say bachelor buttons would be a great example. If you harvest bachelor buttons hard twice a week, they will continue blooming for weeks and weeks and weeks. So you can actually rescue them. I mean, I call that CPR, where you're trying to like get something that you may have screwed up in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
So in my opinion, it is never too late to thin.
Okay, so how does someone know what spacing to leave between plants? Is this the same spacing listed on their seed pack for transplant spacing? So let's say there's a seed that can go either way. You can transplant or direct seed,
Right.
but the pack doesn't reference what spacing to thin to. It just says to space your transplants a certain distance apart. Is that the same distance you're aiming for when you're thinning?
Yes, typically that's pretty much what you're going to. And the other thing to remember is, for me, when I direct sow, I only put 3 rows of seeds in a 30-inch bed to allow more room to leave for my hoeing, to make it quick and simple and easy. So they really have more space side to side. So you just keep that in mind is what I want to just say, like bachelor buttons, I mean, so you just keep that in mind. They have more elbow room than they do front and back room.
Right. And when you're thinning, do you try to leave the strongest plants in place, or do you very strictly adhere to the spacing you're aiming for? So if you're trying to do 6-inch spacing, do you always do that 6 inches? Or if you see a particularly strong, healthy looking seedling, do you leave that in place and kind of fudge the spacing for that section?
That's a great question. So definitely I do that. Sometimes there'll be 2, let's use again, bells of Ireland. There'll be 2 kind of just a couple inches apart that are just both gorgeous. What I'll do then is just clear the way on the other side in that line to give them space. And I learned that concept when I learned seed starting from Elliott Coleman for soil blocking. We learned about in the 2-inch blocker, instead of planting one beet seed in a small block and planting a bunch of them to put 3 or 4 beet seeds in the 2-inch blocker, but then plant those blocks 12 inches apart instead of planting the individuals 3 inches apart. And that's the concept. They just need space and air and opportunity, and you can do that. So yes, fudge on the spacing to keep the best plants.
Yes. Do what you can to keep the strongest, best looking plants in place.
Yes.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the actual methods you can use to thin. So people are wondering, should they pull the seedlings out? Should they use scissors to snip them off at the base, or should they use a hoe?
So those are all great thoughts. And I'll tell you that I do a couple of things. It depends on when we were in high production. I remember one particular year, we had 5 beds, 120 feet long, 5 beds of larkspur alone, all the different colors. That's a lot of thinning to do. So the first course of thinning would be to use our stand-up garden hoe, which is the trapezoid. And you just go down, because that's about 5 or 6 inches. I think it's a 6-inch blade. I would just pull through. I mean, I would go from side to side and just make a hole, and then someone would follow along behind, and the cluster of plants that may have been left, they would just hand pull those out. And so it really depends on your volume of what you have to do. I prefer to use either the stand-up garden hoe or the Japanese hand hoe. Again, just going from side to side and making these, just making holes using that, and then doing fine tuning. And again, that's because we oversow so much. And it just makes it quick and simple. And you are pulling and removing those roots.
Yes. And another tip too, if you're going to be going the hand pulling route, is if you wait until maybe after it's rained and the soil's a little bit damp, things tend to pull out a lot easier, just like when you're weeding.
Yes, for sure.
And do you do anything with scissors?
No, because that's much, I mean, if you had, 1 3-foot garden maybe to do, that might be it. But you don't want to, I mean, it's easier for me to pull by hand. It's quicker and more efficient.
I agree. And this is another question we see a lot. Can I replant the seedlings that I'm pulling up? And have you had any success doing this?
Let me say this loud and clear. I have tried this so many times over the years, when either we had holes in our beds. I can remember one year in particular, holes in the beds, and it was thick down here and whatever happened. And I spent a lot of time carefully scooping up the seedlings. I would use our big giant scoop, which really gets a lot of root ball, in soil, and replanted them. And because they're going, I mean, it kind of just voids the entire cool season concept, a cool flower concept, because now they have to become reestablished again. So I have had almost virtually zero existence, success doing that. And I understand people's dilemma, but you just have to let that go. This is like the cost of doing it. You sow heavily, you're going to have to thin. You won't damage the seedlings that you're leaving by trying to dig out the seedlings in between. So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah. And remember that a lot of these seeds that prefer to be direct seeded in the first place actually have root structures like a taproot. Obviously, not all of them have this, but that makes them very opposed to root disturbance, and they just don't transplant well, especially as they've been growing in the ground for a while. So just keep that in mind. But as we always say, feel free to do your own experiments.
Exactly.
All right. Well, that was our episode for today. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Remember to subscribe. And if you're listening over in a podcast app, we always appreciate you leaving us ratings or reviews. And we love when you like and comment over on YouTube.
Thank you, Layne. Another great show today, friends. Remember, you can learn more about us over at thegardenersworkshop.com. Until we meet again, happy flowering.
Ooh, yeah. Bye.